Hello, and welcome to the Scouse Science Podcast. My name is Professor Tom Solomon. I'm here at the University of Liverpool, where I'm Professor of Neurology and Director of the UK's Emerging Infections Research Unit. My guests today are Guardian columnist and BBC Radio 4's Jonathan Freedland, and my boss, the Vice-Chancellor, Dame Janet Beer, whose background is in American English literature, plus, of course, my friend Holly Ellis, who is a real Scouse scientist. Say hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hey there.
Good
Hi.
to see you all. Thanks so much for joining me. Now, first of all, a little bit of housekeeping. We are live on Zoom. As always, we have thousands of people listening around the country and around the world. We're also on the University of Liverpool Facebook page. I have it here, and it works. So we like you as our guests to join in, and we always like to check that the chat function is working on Zoom or the comment function on the Facebook. So to check if it's working, please go down to chat and say hello. Tell us if you are a first timer or a repeat offender. And then also for today's poll, we're going to be talking a little bit about poetry because Janet's background is in American English literature and poetry. So for today's poll, we'd like you to tell us your favorite poem or poet. So put that into the chat function and we'll have a look at that and see what's coming through. And we've already got some people. Kerry says she's a repeat offender. We'll read. Scouse 5 is my Auntie Judy's here again. Okay, hi Judy. What about a poem, anyone? Can you give us a poem or a poet? Jonathan, we're going to talk to Janet after about hers, but Jonathan, would you like to, are there any poets you'd like to offer to us?
Gosh, that's you've completely ambushed me with that one.
All right,
you gave
we'll come
us
back
no
to you.
warning, but that's fine. I'm sure we can come up with something. But I defer to. I'll come up with something. But why don't we hear from
Janet?
Why don't we hear from Janet first? Yeah.
Okay.
Of course, you know, I have lots of favourite poems, but I think my favourite poet is Wallace Stevens. And a poem that I absolutely adore and always find something new in is Sunday Morning. But if we're going to go with something accessible for the audience, then have a look at The Emperor of Ice Cream.
The Emperor of Ice Cream. Okay, everyone's making a note of that up and down the country. I certainly am. And Holly, I did give Holly a little bit of warning, but I don't know if she's got a poet to hand. Holly?
So I'm not huge into poetry, but I do know one that I really like, and that's it's Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Very famous one.
We've got people saying Edward Lear. That's coming from Helen Shaw. Someone called RCHS Zoom. I bet that's the Royal College of, what will that be?
Horticulturalists.
Do you think so? They say Seamus Heaney. Let us know what.
Oh, definitely horticulturalists.
Definitely. Okay. And Jonathan, do you want to suggest anyone?
Well, I'm noticing on the chat some of the ones coming through, and I would definitely share the enthusiasm for Robert Frost, a wonderful poet, and I would always mention Philip Larkin. As a younger and slightly more sort of naive figure, I probably liked E. Cummings, but I still remember the poems of Lewis MacNeice or Louis MacNeice. Janet will tell me how we say his first name.
I think it's Liberty Hall there.
Good. And some of those poems, which I did study actually a long time ago, and I've sort of found myself coming back to.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking at my iPad. I'm trying to get the comments from the people on the Zoomers, not the Zoomers, the Facebookers, but they'll get fed in anyway in due course. Now, we're going to say goodbye to Holly. She's going to keep track of what's happening on the technologies and feed some questions in a bit later on.
See you later, Holly.
Thanks, Holly. See you a bit later.
Thanks.
And let me now introduce our guests properly. So first of all, Jonathan Freedland is an award-winning journalist and author and broadcaster. He writes a weekly column for The Guardian and is probably also very well known for The Long View on BBC Radio 4, which is, I listen to most of them, often on catching up on the podcast. Now, he went to school in London. He went to Wadham College, Oxford, where I think we overlapped by about a year, but I don't think I really knew you then, Jonathan.
Were you far too cool for me?
Definitely. Were you doing English or history or something?
I did PPE, which was not personal protective equipment, but was philosophy, politics, and economics. And but we were not nearly cool enough to hang out with the scientists and medics.
But we did meet each other more recently, a year or so ago, doing University Challenge. as alumni from Wadham College, Oxford, which was completely terrifying. Thankfully, Jonathan knew things. I discovered that I knew very little beyond science, and even
we were a decent team, weren't we?
We were a good team. We were a good team. Now, Janet is the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Liverpool. She was formerly Vice-Chancellor at Oxford Brookes University. She was given a damehood in 2018 for services to higher education and equality and diversity. And Janet, you started, it wasn't called training, is it, unless it's medicine, at the University of Reading and then Warwick. And then you spent time at Yale University as well, I think. How long were you
as a fellow? Yeah,
as a fellow. How long were you there for?
Only a year, because the writer that I was working on for my PhD, Edith Wharton, she left all her literary papers to Yale, and the rather magnificent Beinecke Library at Yale houses 80,000 items, all from Wharton's bequest.
Wow.
So, I mean, unfinished novels, plans for stories, plays, translations, poetry, letters, you name it.
So it was a treasure trove.
Oh, absolutely. And reasonably unexplored at that stage. I was there in the early 80s.
Did you was a year long enough, or would you have liked to stay longer?
It was. I taught a bit while I was there and did various other things. But in the main, I was just in the archive with my pencil every day, writing everything down.
And Jonathan, you were the Washington correspondent, I think, for a while. Was that for The Guardian?
It was for The Guardian in the 1990s. I was there for the first Bill Clinton term, and a bit into the second, actually, till about 97, and then came back to cover this very newfangled thing called New Labour and Tony Blair becoming Prime Minister here. So that's what brought me back, and I've been back since.
So
can I just mention one thing that Tom left out of the introduction, which is absolutely shameful, Tom? I'm shocked.
Sorry,
is
boss.
that Jonathan is also Sam Bourne, and I hugely enjoyed To Kill the Truth.
Oh, well, thank you, Janet, very much. And I'm very glad you mentioned that, because there is a Yale connection. Because Sam Bourne, or rather me, under the name Sam Bourne, I wrote a novel called Pantheon, which is set in Yale, based on a real episode, which is that you may know about this, but that a whole... Tom, have I got a minute to tell you about this?
Go ahead, episode? Go ahead.
Yale University offered safe harbour to the children of academics at Oxford and Cambridge during the war. In 1940, there was such fear that Britain was going to be defeated and overrun that they said, why didn't you send us your children to as effectively evacuees to Yale University? And lots of people did it. And I interviewed some of the people then in their 70s who had been there as children. What they did not know, and what Pantheon is about, is that the motive for some of the people offering this invitation from Yale was less benign, which was that Yale was full of people who were big on eugenics at the time and believed that the children of the elite of England needed to be preserved in order to be sent back to England later, potentially to sort of reseed a defeated country with a kind of genetic master race. And they were very big on this stuff, and the Eugenic Society and all kinds of people were based in Yale at the time.
Blimey,
it does not surprise me at all. I thought you were going to talk Skull and Bones to me, but
that's an element. You've got to go to Pantheon.
I will definitely read that one.
Skull and Bones is in there.
I will read that one.
Which is
what I loved about the book, and then I'll stop. I mean, just wonderful plotting.
Yeah,
thank you. Thanks very much.
Well, we were Janet, fear not. We were going to get to the to Jonathan's work as Sam Bourne later on, because I promised him if he came on, we would do some fearless and shameless plugging of all his work. But it's okay. It's okay to get that in early. But I was going to ask you about, and today our audience will have noticed today's a little bit different, because usually from the University of Liverpool, we have a scientist, and we don't have a scientist from the university. But, I think in some ways it's time to move on a little bit beyond all the COVID stuff. But we will talk about COVID a little bit. And I was going to start with America, actually. You've both lived there. I lived there in the early 2000s. And, their response and how things have happened in terms of COVID there have been quite different to here. And I wondered whether you had any reflections on that based on your time there and what you know about the country. Maybe we'll start with you, Jonathan, and then come to Janet.
Well, I'm really interested in what Janet says. I mean, the first thing that really comes out is how much politics matters. And, people who cover politics and write about it, we sometimes worry that, this is our, people talk about the Westminster Village, or in Washington, they talk about inside the Beltway, as if somehow this is just a kind of minority sport. And then you see something like the pandemic play out, where the difference it makes having, in the first phase, lack of presidential leadership, a president who was either disengaged or positively hostile to public health messaging, Donald Trump, against masks, telling people to inject themselves with bleach, telling them it was all going to blow over, not wanting to endorse social distancing or lockdown, and, a huge colossal death toll and zero progress on vaccination. And then there's a change of political leadership. The election goes, a different way, and suddenly 200 million people are injected with vaccine before even 100 days are up. And even though America is an amazingly decentralized political system, so it was 50 states all pursuing their own thing, doing their own thing, the difference it makes having a federal government having national leadership, and it's a life and death difference.
Yeah. Janet?
Yeah, no, I absolutely echo that. The decentralization, as Jonathan said, we think we've got 4 nations, doing their own thing, but, 50 states. And as you say, incoherent, if not willfully misleading leadership. But if ever leadership was demonstrated, then Biden has done it, right? I don't think anybody thought that we could move so fast in such a positive direction in the face of, as you say, all those different forms of resistance from different states, particularly in the South.
So clearly politics matters. I think you're right, that transformational change in America has been startling. What about the politics in this country? Do you think things would have been very different in this country under a different leadership?
I'm not so sure it would have been that different, just because the initial onrush of decisions were so intense, and for everyone actually in because of living memory, new and unprecedented. There was obviously no institutional memory around from the last global pandemic in 1918, 1919. So it's hard to point to. That said, I think that that it made a big difference that Boris Johnson's instinct was this kind of libertarian instinct. So the hesitation he had about lockdown at the beginning, I don't think a Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, would have had that hesitation. I don't think he'd have been as worried by that. And so therefore, yes, that is a difference. And I also do think the other PPE, that it is a scandal, the procurement of that, and the idea of cash ministers, what was it called, a VIP lane, a high priority lane for contacts of ministers and civil servants. I think, and I may be wrong about this, but a newly elected government, that's what it would have to have been, a Labour government, would have been extremely wary of that. It's not the sort of thing that you would rule out happening 5 or 6 or 10 years into government. But let's say there'd been a newly arrived Labour government. I don't think they would have felt too scrutinised, too watched, to think it was okay to essentially hand out these huge contracts to mates and party donors to companies that had no track record in the manufacture of PPE, or indeed in making anything. I mean, some of them had no employees and no assets and no property. They had £100 on the books and just thought, I'll do that, I'll make masks, and got contracts in the 8 or 9 figure contracts, 10 figure contracts. Maybe. No.
Do you think that was purely, do you think that was all purely malignant, as it were, or was there an element of panic, and anyone who says they can do anything, we've got to get this moving as quickly as possible, so we'll make it happen?
So definitely that was going on, but within that's what I mean. It's the absence of a worry that they would be too tightly scrutinized. There was a sense of complacency that we can get away with this because we've just won this massive 80-seat majority. We've been in for 11 years. We're a bit untouchable. And that's whereas I imagine, I may be wrong about this, and it's one of those things you can never prove, but I would imagine a newly installed government, yes, they would have had the big bump of winning an election, but I think they would have felt on their guard and wouldn't have felt that kind of they would have felt worried about it. And what was, I'm not suggesting one side is more moral than the other, you'll notice. I'm just suggesting one side would have been worried about the scrutiny and one was not worried. And even setting up the notion of a sort of VIP lane priority access, that is just odd, considering there were plenty of people who were really capable of making it, who just could not get their calls answered. So therefore that suggests it wasn't just desperate urgency to get the kit out the door.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it wouldn't have made much difference, hopefully wouldn't have made much difference, whichever political party was in power, as regards taking notice of the scientists. Now, I know the decisions have been political, but, this has been, it sounds perverse to say it, since the pandemic has been so horrendous, but it's a good moment to be a scientist, right, Tom? Science is supreme in this. The evidence, the advice, it's up to politicians if they take it or if they ignore it. But the science has been there. And, we have, in our public life, we now have the voice of science in a way that's not been true for years.
Yeah, I think it has been a good time for science. Science has really answered some of the questions. And it's, I don't think for the most part it's been lacking. I think we have delivered in all sorts of ways. So you think the voice of science is now stronger? Do you think that it'll disappear again as things return back to normal? And indeed, do you think it should have been stronger beforehand anyway? Do you want to know have a guess at how many cabinet ministers have a science background, members of the cabinet? There's about 40 people in the cabinet, I think.
Yeah, it's none, isn't it?
It's one.
Yeah, I was going to say one. Who's the one?
I'm going to forget now. I want to say Alok Shah, and I think it's something like physics, but one of the followers on the Facebook can let us know.
Very interesting. I mean, it's really interesting, that phrase that Janet used about the voice of science. I mean, one thing that's been a bit of an education to me is that that there are voices of science, and it is. Yeah. Now, I know that's an obvious thing to say, but I think journalistically, where my industry was at fault, is I think we did want there to be a voice of science and there to be a simple, clear answer. Tell us when to lock down. And I suspect politicians were the same. And when, we now know that there were conflicting views in SAGE and there were different positions. And I think that for people who are not scientifically literate, and I definitely include myself in that, that is a bit of a shock. We naively thought, look, in our fields, whether it's English literature or history and politics, we know there's huge argument. But somehow there was an assumption that science, there is a sort of single answer, 2 + 2 = 4, or it doesn't. And therefore, I think that was a bit how people approached the pandemic, which is, okay, tell us what to do. And the presence of conflicting views has been difficult. And that would be the one bit where I would be slightly forgiving to the politicians, especially in the first phase, in February, March, where you could imagine Boris Johnson confused by the differing advice he was getting. Where it's not at all forgivable is much later, because by then he should have had his own experience to say, err on the side of caution in September, October. And so that when there were even just some, and in fact it was almost all scientists saying then, lockdown now early to prevent a second wave, he should have heeded that and didn't. But in the first phase, I think the plurality of advice, I can see why those who don't have a scientific education find even just the idea of that difficult.
It's not so much about, well, that's what PPE is for, isn't it? So the Prime Minister and others who have those degrees, they know how to reside in a culture of ambiguity.
PP, just to clarify for our audience, PP as in politics, philosophy and economics at the moment. This degree you get at places like Oxford that sort of lines you up to go into.
And Liverpool, Tom.
And Liverpool.
So so they are used to making decisions in those, kind of spaces where there is no certainty. It's, opinion, as Michael Gove would have it, is really important. When I said the voice of science, there is clarity around what the disease is and how catastrophic its effects are. Where you have the voices is about how to respond to that, right? That then veers you into social science as well as, but using the scientific evidence. So it's what happens after you get out of the lab, if you like, that is hard. And we know better than most at Liverpool, because my colleagues, Louise Kenny and Ian Buchan, have been dealing with the people who are, very anti the use of lateral flow tests. We've had all that, haven't we, Tom? I mean, you're the expert in this area.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting. And I think, Jonathan, in some ways, you're being a bit too forgiving, really, to say, oh, well, there are differences in science opinion, so you'll therefore allow the government, you'll let them off the hook for the first wave of the pandemic. I mean, I think there have always been differences of science opinion, just as there are differences in terms of opinion what to do economically or politically. There are always views, but the government set up an advisory group of experts for the emergency, as they always do, and they then get a set of a condensed opinion, as it were. So they don't have to listen to all the toing and froing. They'll get a consensus opinion, and that consensus opinion might be a range of options. But I don't think things are massively different there. And but I also think that the thing that kind of strikes me when you talk about that, science, journalists being surprised that science has differences of opinion. The thing that always strikes me on the Today programme, and I'm not talking about during the pandemic, but I'm talking about in the past, when there's they're not particularly good at dealing with anything scientific, or at least they haven't been perhaps until the last year or so. And there would always be a scientist would come on, whatever the issue was, and then they'd have another scientist, and they would always want them to sort of argue when in fact they're basically saying the same thing.
Yes.
So it seems that journalism likes that kind of point of view.
That's a good sort of counter. Actually, I was sort of thinking that the assumption was you can just get a single answer rather than even the range, and that you just tell us what to do. But actually, yes, in a way, that there's a media bias the other way, which is towards sort of conflict even when there isn't. And obviously the definitive example is on the climate crisis, where until relatively recently the BBC would sort of say, here's a speaker to say the Earth is round, and here's one to say the Earth is flat, and then they've now, if they've more or less banned that internally and said we shouldn't do that anymore. But I think perhaps in a situation like this, I think there was a desire for a kind of black or white clarity in terms of what to do right at the beginning, and instead there was a sort of choice and of options, and it was, as Janet absolutely rightly says, a political choice. And what we pay politicians for is to be able to weigh up the advice and decide what's right. And Boris Johnson should have just thought, given the alternative, I must err on the side of caution, given the alternative is unnecessary deaths. And therefore, obviously, you have to lock down. And as I say, I think that's doubly true come the autumn.
I tell you, we're going to get Holly in a minute, just hear what's been happening out on the airwaves. But let me just share with you both one thought, because we were talking about America. Here's something that we'll never know the answer to. But I often think it would have been fascinating if this pandemic had started in America rather than in China, because I think by the time it got here, we'd seen China doing its lockdowns, which we initially thought, well, we don't do that in the West. That's all rather strange. And then, of course, Italy started doing it as the only way to cope. And then by the time it got here, yes, we have done the lockdown. And I think if the whole thing had started in America, they wouldn't have pushed for lockdown so early, possibly even not at all. As you know, there was this idea early on of let it rip and let herd immunity protect us. And it's fascinating to think about how different things might have been if the pandemic had started there rather than in Asia.
Did the Spanish flu start in the US, Tom?
Good question. So it's called the Spanish flu because it was first reported from there. But I think the feeling is it may have started in the US, and it particularly spread, didn't it, among troops. And they didn't do lockdowns as such back then. They did, but there was a lot of, I think what happened with flu was people who could lock themselves away and keep away from society did, but those who couldn't did not. And we'll come to Jonathan, who's done a long view or several long views relating to the pandemic. But let's just get Holly in. And Holly, join us, please, and tell us what people have been talking about on the airwaves and what questions or comments there might be.
Thanks, Tom. So we've got a comment from Roger Phillips, who confirmed that it was Alex Sharma, who was the cabinet member who's got a degree in applied physics. Again, I don't know if that's Roger Phillips from BBC Merseyside or just another Roger Phillips, but who knows?
Of course it is. He's our #1 fan, I think. Just after my Auntie Judy, he's always here. Who else?
Yeah. And we've got lots of comments from people on Facebook and on Zoom telling us their favourite poets. We've got Edward Lear, Mario Benedetti, William Blake, Etiquette by W.S. Gilbert. So lots of people commenting with the favourite poets. So just want to tell people, if you've got any questions for any of the guests, then obviously please do put the questions in. I had a question actually for Janet, because I know that you're interested in equality and diversity, and you know, we're talking about this whole voice of science and how science and politics have really been put on show with the COVID pandemic. How do you think that equality and diversity are sort of displayed amongst politicians and scientists, or do you think we need to increase the diversity amongst politicians and scientists today?
Well, certainly in politics, I mean, there is definitely an absence of women at the moment. And I was looking at the mayoral candidates and indeed the local election candidates, and it's pretty appalling actually in terms of gender. But it does let you know something about the state of politics, doesn't it, in terms of what you're putting yourself up for. And I know that, you know, a lot of women politicians have talked about this, you know, Jess Phillips very eloquently. In terms of science, I think women have had a reasonable showing. In our university, obviously, Tom's faculty is led by Professor Louise Kenny, but the experts have been, you know, predominantly male. But if it inspires lots of young women to go into science, that's absolutely fantastic. We know that there is a huge increase in application for medical school places right across the whole sector. But actually medicine isn't the problem, and Tom knows this from teaching. Vet medicine isn't the problem. Dentistry isn't the problem. It's the physical sciences where we've still got, you know, serious absence of women. So there's a whole generation coming through, but it has been male dominated. You're right, Holly.
Thanks, Holly. So Janet, you headed the Equality Change Unit for a while, which was all about supporting women in science and other aspects. And I know that at one point you said that even though you were a Vice-Chancellor, I think, of Oxford Brookes, when you would travel abroad with male colleagues, you said that people would assume you were the PA, the personal assistant to one of the others. And I think in 2013, you said in The Guardian that you felt that higher education was not as progressive in those terms as it should be. I mean, do you think anything's changed? Have things improved?
They have, as regards leadership, hugely. The sad thing is now, I notice I don't know whether it's a domino effect, and I don't know whether it's anything to do with the pandemic, but a lot of my generation of women vice-chancellors, a lot of them are retiring now, leaving, passing on. We've got to about 30%, maybe a little bit more. But what is significant is that when women first started to be appointed, they were appointed characteristically to...
I think she's frozen for me. Maybe I've frozen.
No, she's frozen for me.
All right, while she warms up again, let me just explain. We've had a question in from Jenny Morris. Can we explain what we mean by the physical sciences? So that means things like chemistry, physics, engineering, those kind of sciences, as opposed to things like medicine, dentistry. We also, so she really has frozen, hasn't she? Well, maybe one of the team, actually, yeah. Because she's the Vice-Chancellor, I'm the only person with her mobile number. They don't, oh, here we are, she'll be back. There you are, Janet, you're back.
She's
are you
back.
Okay? You're just on mute at the moment, and I think we lost you.
Sorry.
No worries, to the gremlin.
All I got round to was, there's no room for complacency.
Yeah, let me put this question to both of you. We'll probably let Holly go now and keep an eye on the questions. And we are very keen on
thanks.
questions coming in via the chat function. This one has come in. How does science and the media engage and persuade those members of the public who are currently disenfranchised from scientific information and choose to form their own opinions from other sources, e.g. social media, conspiracy theorists, lizard people, I don't know what lizard people are, etc.? What are your thoughts about how we try to convince people who are disenfranchised? And Jonathan, I know you did, one of your long views was about vaccines and anti-vaxxers, both now and in the past. What are your views on that?
Well, I thought the long view thing was helpful, partly just to realize this isn't a wholly new problem, that even in the case of smallpox and the development of really in a way the first vaccine, the people of Leicester, particularly in the story we did, were deeply resistant to the vaccine, and they were the anti-vaxxers of their day. So often with the long view, I do think it's quite reassuring to people to realize we're not encountering this problem for the first time. The problem is greater now, though, because of the ease of dissemination of information in general, but particularly false information. So now it's anyone with an internet connection can immediately disseminate things that are false and untrue to a huge audience. And lizard people, this is the conspiracy theory of David Icke, that there are people who are secretly lizards. I mean, crazy stuff that would have been dismissed. The problem is that, and it's nobody ever wants to defend gatekeepers, because gatekeepers sounds like sort of terribly elite and establishment. You're not meant to be in favor. But it was the case before that to have access to the channels of information, there were people who kept guard of those. And I often liken it to a water supply, that you wouldn't want anyone with access to the water supply where they could contaminate it with pollutants and just chuck any old thing in there, potentially poisonous things in there. And yet we do not guard, or rather we are sort of wary of guarding in the same way our information supply, even though I do think it is a public health resource. And so you're left with two possible courses of action here, because I think the question was what do we do about it? One is that you call on the social media platforms to not be this, as they currently are, this sort of hands-off, it's nothing to do with us, we're just a platform, we're not publishers. Well, no, if you are giving a platform to somebody saying that COVID doesn't exist and that everyone you're seeing dying in hospitals is an actor, then you are a publisher of that view. And so they've got to take responsibility for that. And then I suppose the second piece of it is, the longer term stuff, which is to equip people with a kind of media literacy. So there is one approach to this which says, okay, we've just got to teach everyone science. And I think somebody on the chat says, should we make science compulsory for 16 to 18-year-olds? I mean, that seems a very uphill task to me, because there are some people who just don't take to it. But what you can teach to absolutely everybody is a kind of media literacy, so that people can tell when something is fake or ungrounded or unevidenced. And there are ways to do it. I mean, the BBC did something recently, which I thought was great, a little 30-second video aimed at kids, Bite Size, and BBC Bite Size did this, so that you can tell when something is false. And there are ways of telling. You can literally look for the URL, you can look for, if it's an established news provider or not. That's where I think is going to be safer, so that they can look at something which is from some COVID denier and just realize on its face, this is not quality information. This is a contaminant rather than a healthy supply. And I think that's probably something we're going to have to do.
Yeah, if I can just pick up on that, what you're really talking about, Jonathan, is compulsory media studies. Now, I'd vote in favour of that. We've been talking about the wonders of science, but actually media studies graduates are the most qualified of all our graduates in order to critique, as you say, and discriminate. And what we need is people to help us to do that. But the misinformation, as you say, it's always been there. And, America is the home of the conspiracy theory, isn't it? They are as old as time. They just used to travel in different ways. And even, in the 80s, when I lived there were 4 sources of information. And now, as you say, Jonathan, there are so many sources of information that are completely unmediated, and they grip people in ways that I find hard to comprehend.
I think you're absolutely right to use the word grip, because I mean, there is a fascinating study that came out of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and published in Science, which was that the false story travels around the internet 6 times faster than the true one. And you know, they really did measure it to see how far it disseminated through social media networks and how far it had gone, how many nodes it had reached, you know. And it's 6 times faster. And why is that? And it is partly because it is gripping. It is more interesting so often. I mean, you can, the full story will have a drama in it that the reality often can't keep up with, because reality sometimes is quite sort of slow and, you know, nuanced and pedestrian. Whereas if you say that, you know, Hillary Clinton was part of a child trafficking ring operating out of the basement of a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C., which was a full story that did go viral in 2016 and has sort of lived on, and partly was responsible for the QAnon phenomenon. Well, that's just more dramatic than, you know, the reality of there is a vote coming before the Ways and Means Committee of the House of Representatives, which is in its second committee stage of, you know, that's just duller. And reality is often just more prosaic than stuff you can make up.
Even if you know it's false, I mean, a story like that, a title like that, it's kind of irresistible to click.
Yes.
Even if you know it's nonsense, and that happens so much.
Who was it said, rumour is halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on?
Yeah.
So
somebody.
Interesting
though that you're suggesting media studies should be you know, taken more seriously at school, and maybe science. I certainly think I agree with whoever said on the chat. I think the fact that you can stop all your science education at age 16, and also the content of a lot of that science education is actually not stuff that's relevant. I think one thing the pandemic has shown us is the kind of education that people need in terms of understanding things like risk, understanding the basics of transmission. You know, and when you consider that our cabinet, only one of our cabinet members has any science education beyond age 16, it's perhaps no wonder that maybe people like Boris were a bit like a rabbit in the headlights when faced with something where you do need just a basic understanding of the scientific concept, things like testing hypotheses. And if you don't have that, you're really having to catch up on a lot of information very, very quickly.
Yeah, can I just respond on the media studies thing? My only hesitation would be about sort of calling it that and making it necessarily the whole course.
I'm being provocative.
No, I knew you were, and you're
right. It is the whipping. It's the whipping,
like,
boy, isn't it?
It's the underwater basket weaving, isn't it?
It's got that brand problem. But also what I was thinking partly was that even if you don't study it as a full GCSE or something, it could just be part of your education, in the sense of, you know, whether it's dealt with in kind of school assemblies or in kind of you know, form time or something.
Citizenship.
I mean, I've been invited to schools, and this is what I always speak about. And there are those slots in the school timetable where you get an outside speaker, or you get, because in other words, I don't think it necessarily needs months and months and years of study. I think the reason why I loved that little BBC bite-sized video it was actually a 30 seconds video where you sort of got it. I think you could do an hour or two, and people would then develop the basic vigilance to know, okay, so if it's, you know, not a real news organization, it's unlikely to be wholly reliable. That, you know, that story, I think I mentioned the trafficking, there was, it may have been that one, or it could have been the one that's saying the Pope endorses Trump, and it came from a thing called Denver News. And the real news organization in Denver is the Denver Post, a very long established newspaper, really reliable. Denver News wasn't. And, you know, there are ways of just spotting this stuff quite quickly if you know what you're looking for. And so I don't know whether we need to say, it's not partly, I'm just being pragmatic. I worry that school, you know, the government wouldn't agree to everything with media studies. They might agree to this.
I think that's what Janet means, isn't it? And similarly with science, I'm not saying everybody should do science to A level, but I'm saying there's a certain amount of science that everybody should do and not abandon at 16. I think it's a sort of argument in favour of the Scottish Highers type approach, isn't it? And perhaps our education becomes very narrow very quickly. Janet,
it's media literacy, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's media literacy. And we need people to be able to critique, you know, what is coming at them, and to always think about, well, I wonder where this came from.
And I guess
it's about the
I'm
provenance.
talking about scientific literacy, perhaps, rather than
yes, exactly.
My girls at their school, they do this thing called PHSE, which I can't never remember what it stands for, but that's the bit filling in the important bits on life, which in my mind should also include things like educating on things like what a mortgage is and what a bank statement looks like. Just basic things you need to know if you for the rest of your life. We're going to get Holly back in a minute, but I mean, we're talking about the internet, about the kind of things that are unregulated. You guys are both in the public eye. I am a little bit. You guys both are a little bit more. And I wanted to come back to your book or your books, Jonathan. Why the pseudonym? Why Sam Bourne? Why not Jonathan Freedland? Was this to protect yourself from the
No, it's funny how that came about. It was for the very first one. I had an idea that turned on a kind of religious, mystical idea, conspiracy thing, an idea I'd had a long time, but suddenly my agent was interested in it once the Da Vinci Code came out. He said, "Oh, there could be an audience for this. Only problem is your name," he said. And I said, "What's wrong with my name?" And he said, "Your name sounds like a pointy-headed columnist for a pointy-headed newspaper. Too many syllables, just a long, elaborate name." Whereas thriller writers do tend to have these quite short, monosyllabic, sort of muscular names. Dan Brown, Lee Child, and so Sam Bourne.
What's wrong with John Free?
Yeah, John Free, maybe that could have worked. Although you do need a sort of hard sound somewhere. I don't dislike that. Could have gone for that. And so Sam Bourne was born.
All right, fair enough. And Janet, do you? You've written books in relation to your subject, but is there a novelist in there waiting to come out?
Well, of course, it's an enduring fantasy in my lifetime that I've got a novel in me. But the truth of the matter is, I can write a decent sentence, but I'm rubbish at plots. So I think that probably will not be my fate, although I would like it to be.
The plot is key to the novel, of course. But Jonathan, you're writing now a non-fiction work about a scientist. Are you okay to talk about that?
Yes, I barely talked about it, but no, but I'm happy to. I'm writing a book about a man called Rudolf Verber, who, as you say, was a scientist in biochemistry and related fields. But the reason why he was so significant was he was a prisoner in Auschwitz for an unusually long time, in that he was he managed to survive being in Auschwitz. He was there from June 1942 all the way till April 1944, when he escaped. And hardly anybody escaped from Auschwitz, and hardly any Jews escaped. And I think it's 5 Jews who escaped, and he, along with another man, was the first. And he escaped for reasons to do with what we're talking about, which is he wanted the world to know what was happening. It was all about telling the world. And so he and his fellow escapee got out. They crossed the border into Slovakia, but they told their story to the surviving Jewish remnant there. And it became known as the Auschwitz Report or the Auschwitz Protocols. And it traveled the world slowly, but it did reach the desk of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill and the Pope, and action did happen as a result of it. But what fascinates me about the story is partly because it is an extraordinary adventure story, how he got out. He was 19 years old. I mean, it's an amazing thing that he did. But also this idea of knowledge and how important it is that you cannot, what we were saying right at the top about, it is the difference between life and death. And he understood that his belief was that if Jews knew what awaited them at Auschwitz, they wouldn't get on those trains, even at gunpoint. They would just rebel. Okay. And he thought that was crucial. So it's all about knowledge and the difference between knowledge and information and truth, and as well as being an absolutely gripping adventure story. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Okay, well, we look forward to that. Let me get Holly back in just to see if there's been any more questions or comments on the chat.
Yes, so there's been quite a few comments on Facebook and Zoom. So Helen Shaw is saying that she works in a primary school and she wishes there was more time to teach these type of things, but obviously a lot of teachers can probably relate to that. The curriculum is so strict. There's another question from Louise Elman on Zoom. who says COVID has made more people aware of the link between science and society, including taking political decisions. What can broadcasters do to develop this?
Broadcasters, Jonathan, you're a broadcaster. What can be done?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true about how important science is. And look, in a way, broadcasters and journalists in general were forced to talk about this by the fact, as Janet was saying right at the beginning, that suddenly we absolutely had to know this stuff, and so scientists, the voices of scientists and of science had to be heard, because again, it was sort of life and death. And I suppose the message for broadcasters and for other journalists is to not get out of that habit. Now that we have got, and sometimes it does come down to almost as basic a thing as this, now that we have the numbers of scientists in our contacts books, that we know the names of eminent scientists, I hope that will become a habit, and that on all kinds of things, people will just think now, well, let's run that past an epidemiologist, or let's run that past a chemist, And it should have happened with the climate crisis. It didn't. And I think maybe the sheer immediacy and urgency of this will change that habit. But, we are prone to fall back into our old habits. So it does require the vigilance of, in some ways, audiences. I mean, people to say, I'd like to hear the scientist view of this. Yeah. And media organizations are much more responsive to that than you'd think.
Can I also put in a word for public health officials as well? Because, I very much enjoyed the dramatization of the Salisbury poisoning, where, of course, the head of public health for the city played such a crucial role in terms of the way in which the capacity of the poison to affect more individuals than the two that it tragically did. So we have been taking advice, during the height of the pandemic, literally on a daily basis from our Director of Public Health, and it's not something that featured in our landscape at all in terms of decision making. So I think it's not only science, is it? It is that public health dimension that we really need to build into the conversations that we have.
It seems there's also in the chat, there's quite a good agreement of need to include science, media, internet, financial awareness in people's educations more broadly. A comment from a retired physics teacher as well, who likes some of those ideas. Yeah, compulsory political education as well, they say. It
is something that I'm sort of taking away from our conversation, that there is an overall kind of need for literacy in all these areas, that scientific, media, basic sort of civics of government. It is interesting. There is a broad definition of not necessarily being an expert in that subject, but knowing enough to function, to be able to tell your, contaminated information supply from your healthy information supply, maybe the same with food and, drink, and being able to sort of handle yourself with your vote and your bank account. I think there's probably a case for this. And we load so much on schools, as the Holly was telling us about the school teacher said, she'd love to, or he would love to, but they're so overloaded with curriculum already. Some way of finding some space to do that. But yes, anything more we pile on teachers, we have to take something away because they have too much to do already.
Now, let me just to finish off, because we are, over time. We're told 45 to 50 minutes is the perfect duration for a podcast. Jonathan, I don't know if yours go over that. Let me finish. Firstly, I'm delighted to say we've got some, I don't know if it classifies as trolling, but given that we've been discussing these things, somebody says that someone in the Liverpool Uni department is working on fake news immunity. And maybe that's not trolling, maybe that is a sensible comment.
It is a sensible comment.
It is a sensible comment. Sorry about that. There was something trolly earlier on the Facebook.
That's all right, Tom. Don't repeat it. Don't give it oxygen.
I know, but it's quite fun. I'm not going to say what it is or who it is, but it's quite fun to feel we're up there. We're up there in the big time. Once you're being trolled, you know you've made some progress.
I chose to leave those out, Tom.
I know you did. You did the right thing, but I just thought we should let people know that we are getting a little bit. But finally, I think the final comment comes from Helen Shaw, who says, when I have conversation with friends about whether to have the COVID vaccine, I recommend the Scouse Science podcast, the information straight from the scientist's mouth. Well, thank you for that, Helen. And I'm posting in the chat for everyone how to catch up on earlier Scouse Science podcasts and how to go to your favorite podcast provider. And when you get there, please click on the subscribe button so that you'll hear all of the podcasts as they get delivered. This is a video podcast, but of course we put it out as an audio podcast as well, so you can listen to it as you're cycling to work or whatever you do. Finally, then, we better stop. I'm going to thank our guests again, Jonathan Freedland, Janet Beer, Holly Ellis. Thanks very much for joining us. The next podcast will be in June, early June. We are not yet able to reveal the date or the guests, but it will be equally exciting, informative, and as entertaining as today's podcast. So we will see you then next time. It's just time for me and all my guests to say goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.